Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to take your seats, please? Hey.
Bara så du vet. Det är neråt som gäller. Jag kom...
Det statliga småföretagsprogram. Jättekul, men annorlunda mot när jag jobbade tidigare.
Men jag kan tänka mig att hela insikten som konsult har jobbat med konsult eller med bolag är väldigt viktigt att förstå för att komma in.
Absolut. Och det tycker jag det finns en del av uppdraget som jag är mycket med att konsultverksamhet.
Since last year, it seems like. I don't know where it's going to go.
Och sen 7 år som statssekreterare till sen har han har ju Sven i båda sidor. Det blir jättebra. Och han sen har vi en ledningen som verkligen kommer från den här delen av verksamheten som inte har konsultbakgrund. På det sättet blir det bra komplettering.
Ja, han är många.
Det är bra.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to welcome our distinguished guests and audience, both here on site in New York and also online, to this New York Climate Week event, Accelerating New York City's Net Zero Journey. This event has been prepared by Team Sweden, the General Consulate of Sweden in New York, Business Sweden, and the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce in New York. My name is Robert Watt. I'm the Engagement Director at Stockholm Environment Institute, and I'm very honored and proud to be today's moderator. Tomorrow, the UN Secretary General has called a UN Climate Ambition Summit. He's got 3 particular elements he wants to focus on: ambition, credibility, implementation. And I think today you're going to hear a lot about the sort of ambition that can be achieved in cities, in partnership between policy and business. You're going to hear solutions that are implementable, actionable right now. And it's really important that we are focusing on cities. UN Habitat says that cities represent more than 60% of global emissions. And also they're really entangled in all of the economic sectors that make up our climate challenge. But they're also the major consumer, which means they're the place that these big purchase orders are going to be placed for the net zero future. So they're real beacons, and the IPCC recognizes that cities are beacons for climate solutions, and they can pioneer those solutions to help us achieve those global goals that we have. I'd like now to hand the floor over to Johan Forssell, Sweden's Minister for for Foreign Trade and the Minister for International Development. Minister.
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, first and foremost, I want to say a big thank you to the Business Sweden, of course, to the Consulate General, and also to the Swedish Chamber of Commerce for organizing this very important event. It's great to be here in New York. I arrived the day before yesterday, and we will stay until Thursday for a very important and also hectic week with the ANGA meeting, the Climate Week, and so many things going on at the same time. But it's a true privilege to be here today and meeting all of you. And we will today focus on the importance of partnerships and also on how businesses not only can but also must play a crucial role in meeting the climate challenges. I participated in the COP27 meeting last year. Perhaps many of you did the same. And I think back then, as well as now, it is obviously very clear that we need more action. I mean, words are important, but it's really action that is needed. And that will still be the case when we meet for COP28 in Dubai here in December. We must, simply put, make this kind of difference. At the same time, so many things have been said about how climate action is about urgency, that we need to adopt, we must make a change. But I think, as the Minister, not only for Development Cooperation, but also for Foreign Trade, I think it's fair to say something else, too, that climate change is also about opportunities. Because the green transition, we believe as a government, is a very clear roadmap to new jobs, new investments, more innovation, better health, and at the same time also more security in the world. So allow me to say a few words on the Swedish ambitions. Our climate policy framework in Sweden establishes that we will reach net zero carbon emissions by 2045, and hopefully also achieve negative emissions thereafter. So we are trying, we are aiming, and we are trying very hard to become the world's fossil-free industrial nation. And of course, to achieve these goals, the public sector, business, academia must work very closely together. And I think this has already led to very concrete results. For example, we have the new technology to produce fossil-free steel, one great example of this. Another thing is the green production of lithium-ion batteries. That's also very important. And well, apologize for bragging, but as the Minister for Trade, this is kind of my work. I think solutions provided by many Swedish businesses, they are really driving climate action in Sweden, but also globally. And that is something that is very important to bear in mind. So the Fossil-Free Sweden initiative has encouraged business sectors to set out their own goals and also to draw up their own roadmaps on how to lower the emissions. And we know that many companies have confirmed their commitment to this initiative, and many of these are also very active here on the US market. So we believe that the green transition, it truly creates numerous opportunities for intensified green collaboration between the US and Sweden, but also between Sweden and New York City. Together, we will drive the green technology implementation and establish concrete partnerships. And I know that New York City aims to become carbon dioxide neutral by the year 2050. We are very happy to see this leadership that New York City is showing. I also know that roughly 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions here from New York City, they come from energy consumption in buildings. And here we truly see great opportunities for collaboration. Other sectors where we see potential are, for example, within the offshore wind electrification, electric cars, it can be transportation, it can be recycling in the carbon sector as a whole. Just to mention a few examples. So the US is, of course, one of the most important export markets for Sweden. Has been so for many years, will definitely continue to be so also for the future. But did you know that Sweden is also the 13th largest investor in the US? It's kind of interesting out of a population of only 10 million people in Sweden. Sweden creates approximately 370,000 jobs here in the US, spread all over 50 different states, including New York. So look at these numbers and imagine the potential and the magnitude of technological innovations that would see the day with an even closer collaboration between all of us. And on that positive note, I end here. I look forward to learning more about New York City's net zero journey, and first and foremost, on how Sweden and New York can continue to collaborate even further in the future. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much for setting the scene for today. We now have a new speaker, and that is Sander Dolde. Sander, I'm going to give you his title. We had a chat about what he actually does, but I'll give you his title and I'll explain a little bit about what he does. So he is the Senior Vice President at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. What does that mean? Well, he told me that means he drives economic development in emerging sectors. He innovates in policy and supports to innovate in policy and practice. And it's all about creating business attraction in and to the climate transition. Sander, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. You know, I'm going to bounce off a little bit what the minister said and basically give the view of what's happening right now in New York City from an economic development perspective. We're going to hear a lot about some of the more policy-oriented goals and projects a little bit later on, but wanted to set the scene in terms of what's the business opportunity. A lot of us have been waiting for this moment, having been in the city for over a decade now, starting the Bloomberg years. We've been advocating and we've been really strong pushers on the policy front. And now over the last 4 years, it's really kicked into gear as well on the economic development front. And what does that mean? What moment are we in? And I kind of see it as, in the US, it's either 0% or 150%. And it's sort of shifted post-COVID into this very rapid change in society, partially driven by the different levels of government. State and local have been playing a key part in driving that, certainly, but now you have the federal government as well that is really trying to move the dial, not only from changing our energy systems and our transportation systems, but also thinking about how do we think about manufacturing in a context of the 21st century. And so there's a lot there to unpack. But what that looks like when you look at, say, New York City, it's, and particularly EDC, which is sort of an organization that's a quasi-governmental institution. It's really about collaboration. How do we connect the dots? A lot of these players have been working in silos over the years, whether it's government, whether it's private sector, whether it's academia. How do we connect it? And some of that is part of what we do. So just to quickly highlight some of the areas that we think about when we want to build some of these sectors, of course, it's the innovation side. How do we invest in incubators and accelerators? How do we take promising companies from Sweden that are looking to expand in the US market and make sure that New York City is on their list? And once they choose New York, that we give them the right resources to be able to grow here, whether that's connections and networking, whether it's access to the entrepreneurial ecosystem, whether it is understanding the complexity of policy that exists state by state, city by city. So on one hand, there's the innovation side. On the other hand, there's workforce. That is one of the biggest gaps that we see. And we are releasing a report in October that really outlines these are the different jobs that are going to be PhDs in material science. These are all things that we have to think about now because there's already a delay in where the jobs are. So the last piece is really around infrastructure. So we sort of play a role there where we manage a lot of properties. So we're using some to repurpose for the offshore wind industry, for instance, or for battery storage systems, and work with our sister agencies to really understand how to enable that. Can we be the piloting space for how we transition some of these technologies across different city agencies? And part of that is really around the processes themselves. If we have to rapidly decarbonize, if we have to invest in long-term climate adaptation projects, it really takes everyone at the table, and we really have to think about how do we change and modernize some of the processes we have developed over the last decades within government. And it's not that easy. Sometimes it just requires finding the right people and sort of slowly working across the years to get it done. And a lot of that is some of the things we do that are not public facing. And so that is really the point. It really takes, everyone has a role to play. We sort of sit in the middle of public and private. So we are the connector, we are the facilitator between the two. But whether you're in the public sector and you have to think about adopting the next solutions or setting the policies for a city or a state, or if you're on the private sector side, you have to think about innovation. You have to think about training your talent. And you have to think about how you're going to work with the different parties, because you can't build infrastructure without getting permitting, without getting some of these agreements done collaboratively. And I think throughout Climate Week, to me, that's sort of a resounding theme. We have to really learn how to do that, and you'll see later today, a lot of the conversations here sort of exemplify a lot of that, right? A lot of that thinking about how we mix all of these groups together to drive towards these clear, urgent objectives. So thank you, and I'll look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Sander. So we've now heard quite a lot about the overall picture. I was quite amazed by the fact that Sweden is the 13th biggest investor in the US. Amazing stuff. We heard from Sander, actually, really interesting stuff there about the business opportunity, but also the critical role of public-private partnerships in identifying how we work together to provide infrastructure solutions, the right skills as well, to enable this journey towards net zero. We're now going to move on to hear a little bit from the science side. I'm very proud to present Åsa Persson, who is Research Director and Deputy Director of Stockholm Environment Institute, and she's also Chair of the Swedish Climate Policy Council. Over to you, Åsa, to talk about science-based agenda to scale global climate action.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you, Business Sweden, for inviting me. As we all know, it took a long time for both policy and business to really listen to science on climate change. And fun fact, here at New York Climate Week, this year marks the 55 years ago since climate change was first raised in the UN General Assembly by the then Swedish UN Ambassador Sverker Åström. Fortunately, action has been faster in the last 8 years since the Paris Agreement. And now, actually, and led by not least cities around the world, 88% of global emissions are now covered by some sort of net zero target. According to the Net Zero Tracker, 3/4 of countries today have a net zero target. Just over half of the world's biggest 2,000 biggest publicly traded companies have a net zero target. Cities, only a quarter actually of the major cities, those with a population of over 500,000. So it's a fast development since 2015, but still there is a global scaling to do. And early adopters like Sweden with a climate target set in 2017 and New York with its city level target are still important role models in this regard. And of course, pioneering companies too. Science, through integrated assessment and global scenario modeling, has been providing decarbonization pathways for policymakers for a long time, estimating the potential and feasibility of different sectors to reduce emissions through different technologies and, of course, under different policy assumptions like carbon pricing. But now that we're starting to see many, not enough, but many climate solutions on the market, we're really moving from science to art, from estimates in a computer model to reality. Business strategies and policy strategies will determine which solutions can scale and reach those critical tipping points when these solutions are more affordable, more attractive, and more accessible than the more fossil-intensive alternatives. For me personally, one of the most interesting findings of the IPCC mitigation report that came out a couple of years ago was a chart showing the potential in terms of emission reduction and relative cost of mitigation options across energy, transport, land use sectors, etc., compared with the current reference technologies. And indeed, many of these new mitigation options have lower cost, some even negative cost, of course, when it comes to energy savings or energy efficiency. So I really share this view of all the opportunities in the climate transition. Another important knowledge frontier when it comes to decarbonization pathways is how to future-proof net zero strategies in light of climate impacts that we can anticipate. So how can we ensure that the new solutions will work under increasing global warming, and how can we deliver on climate mitigation and adaptation simultaneously? But today I wanted to highlight really two things from the scientific perspective. First, that net zero is not just about the end destination, it's about how we get there. Second, about credibility. So on the first issue, we all know that cumulative emissions matter for the climate over the period to 2050 or mid-century, whatever is the target year. Science has calculated a global carbon budget which is fixed to be distributed across years but not exceeded. I'm part of an international scientific assessment at the moment, the 10 new climate science insights that seeks to each year synthesize the latest science in light of the fact that the IPCC reports are pretty infrequent and have a time lag when it comes to the latest science. One of the key insights that we pick up on this year is the quickly diminishing global carbon budget due to still increasing emissions. It's been estimated that it's now halved actually since the latest IPCC report, from 500 to 250 gigaton assuming a 50% probability of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So we are looking at exceeding the 1.5 degree target in 6 years or so, given current trends. However, this does not mean, of course, dropping a 1.5 degree guardrail, but really looking more how we minimize the peak and the duration of that overshoot. The call from science remains the same, to pursue immediate and deep emission cuts in the order of 45% emission cuts globally by 2030. So what are the policy implications for a country like Sweden or a city of New York? Well, 2030 targets are critical, and the net zero long-term targets need to be broken down into near-term action and checkpoints. For Sweden, we have our national 2030 target, and we are now also bound by the new EU 2030 target, which is more stringent on not delaying action, and it also comes with an annual carbon budget. The second point was on the credibility of climate action and delivering on these targets. So as we know, climate change is a global problem, and Sweden and New York are relatively small emitters when looking at global emissions. And we also know that the Paris Agreement doesn't come with strong compliance mechanisms. So political scientists and legal scholars, including here from the US, the Brookings institutions, are therefore pointing to demonstrating credible near-term action as the de facto compliance mechanism. Demonstrating credible near-term action domestically will lead others to avoid free riding, incentivize others to keep their promises, and provide leverage to avoid that moral hazard of making long-term promises not backed up by action on the ground. In a survey that these researchers made a couple of years ago, the EU was then seen as the most credible party to deliver on the Paris targets, but as we know, a lot has happened here in the US also recently on climate legislation and action. So how do we ensure credibility? Well, for business, there are a lot of initiatives going on, of course, on standards and criteria, voluntary or legislated. For governments at city and national level, it's about presenting climate policy plans and inviting independent review. So I'm honored to have joined the Swedish Climate Policy Council, mandated under the Swedish climate law and climate policy framework to undertake review of the government's climate action plan, and whether it's in line with the Swedish climate targets for 2030 and 2045. And of course, the EU targets are part of that review. Our mandate is also to identify new areas for actions, new opportunities. And interestingly, this Swedish council is just now one of over 20 similar councils around the world. So this is also a practice that is diffusing internationally. In the eyes of New Yorkers, 8 million New Yorkers, and 10 million Swedes, I think credibility does not lie in the plans, the targets, the document as such, but really the tangible and visible action that we see on the ground. It lies in these new solutions developed by innovative companies and city administrations on both the technology and infrastructure side, but also when it comes to nudging new behaviors. So to wrap up, science is of course not only about describing the problem and reviewing progress, but also very much developing these solutions and being a part of the climate innovation ecosystem. To innovate, we need to be imaginative, so visual storytelling, visual breakdown of these pathways to our net zero targets are really important. So I also look very much forward to hearing about the solutions for energy, transport, material consumption, data-driven strategies, and what are the key opportunities and challenges. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Åsa. We've heard and had the scene set for us. We've heard about the science, and Åsa has actually really beautifully introduced the next section of our event today, because we're going to be zooming in on New York City, and we're going to be breaking things down. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Carolina Eklöf from Climate View and Robert Westerdahl from Material Economics and McKinsey, who are going to take us through a presentation that zooms in on New York City.
Thank you so much, Rob. So here's the backdrop to what we're going to look at, data-driven climate investments. And what will make more sense at the end of this session is what it says here in FINE. So to drive change for 2030 and beyond, we need to connect emissions and economics. We think that we can do that with a universal structure of city sectors, where we can use data to understand investment opportunities and the societal benefits across the climate transition. So again, this will make sense as we reach the end of this presentation.
Thank you. No, and having worked with lots of global organizations across the world over the last 15 years on climate change, and starting at McKinsey, then with material economics, and now back with McKinsey, I've seen it going from strategy, long-term planning, long-term investments, to a situation where we are now. We have to do this now. We have to turn our commitments into action. We have to go from saying that we're going to do something to actually doing it and get into the transformations. And we often talk with our clients that this is at the scale of the digital transformation, or when companies underwent kind of lean over the last 20, 30 years. It's really a deep transformation across the company. So how do you actually do that? Well, first of all, I think we cannot only talk about CO2 emissions. And this is a chart that, and regardless if it's a city, a country, a global manufacturing company, starting with emissions, and these are estimated emissions for New York, Scope 1, 2, and 3. They might be wrong, but it's about a bit more than 100 million tons. But then to actually drive change, we also need to look at where are we from an economic perspective. So basically, we estimate you're spending about $23 billion every year on energy, so petrol, heating, natural gas, and so on, and investments in buying new cars, trucks, buses, building new houses, renovating houses of about 12 billion per year. And that's already happening in the current system. That has nothing to do with the clean energy transition. So that's one starting point. And then what's an estimate of what's the cost of air pollution to the city? Because that's a starting point. And we can talk actually about only the right-hand side and then forget about emissions, and then we'll see the emissions go down if we address the economics of it. So I think that is a starting point, and that I think to drive change, that's where we need to go. And then we will come back to that, but basically say, we laid out the plan, see what are the type of actions to bring down emissions by about 45 million tons, and actually only having to add, on top of baseline investments, about $30 billion over a 10-year period. So that's nothing compared to the size of the city. And this number is quite interesting, because I've done this for 15 cities across Europe, and it turns out to be roughly the same per capita. So you're not kind of unique. This is basically the same for Madrid, basically the same for Malmö in Sweden, basically the same for Amsterdam, and so on. And then I think the right-hand side, which is also, when I talk to a lot of mayors or industrial leaders, you can actually forget about the emissions, because this is actually can be a profitable transition if you do it right. And then the side effect is just that you're reducing emissions at the same time. And I think that's where we are now. That wasn't possible 10 years ago. Then prices were too high of the clean technologies. But now we're in a situation actually when we are at cost parity on many, many of these technologies, and it's more a deployment question, and how do you actually make it happen in practice? But so how do we go to action and make it concrete?
Yes, how do you do that? So if we zoom out a little bit and think about cities in general, home to, as you said, Rob, 60%, or as if we ask Antonio Guterres, over 70% of emissions. Cities are also home to over half of the world's population and demand the majority of global energy. So as cities globally transition, it means that everything that moves us, that heats us, cools us, feeds us, it will all have to shift. And for that to be meaningful for climate action, it means moving from carbon to non-carbon, right? It means it's the first principles of physics, really. It's science. And turns out, despite the importance of cities, there's actually no way, there's no structured way of looking at city transition. So this is our best suggestions, and doing that on the basis of physics, on the basis of science. But of course, it's fun to talk about science, it's fun to talk about theory. But what matters is moving science to policy, and that policy to implementation. So we work with 30 cities globally, and we do that not through talking about it, but by providing a platform to implement. And as Robert said, we've borrowed some numbers from the mayor's report here in New York to show what it might look like if this comes up. Yeah, it does. Look, so when we have our data in a structure, in a platform, where you can get that overview and you see the goal and you see a whole bird's eye view on the sectors, you get a better understanding of actually not just what's important, but also where you can get the most bang for the buck. What will have an impact? So this is, as I said, it starts with the first principles of physics. It's really about that small activity shift. But we want to move from that small activity shift all the way up to the sector and make it possible to really look not just horizontally, but vertically as well on the transition. So to sort of sum up, what's important for us is that cities don't base their transition on a sandcastle of qualitative guesses, but on quantitative calculations. Handing over to you, Robert, to take us through how to move from emissions to economics.
Thank you. No, and of course, having that very clear understanding of the baseline, I would say most organizations are there today. 10 years ago, most organizations did not have any idea, maybe Scope 1 emissions, but Scope 2, especially Scope 3, was just nowhere to be found. So there I would say baseline, a lot of organizations know quite well, even though it's it's hard to measure, it's easy to estimate. But moving from there, you're of course from the baseline say, what are our options to cut emissions? What's our energy use? What's our baseline investments? What's our air pollution topics? Can also be around water, biodiversity, and so on. What are all of the impacts that we're having that we want to address? And then moving from that and saying, what can we do to, what does it cost? What are the investments needed? What is the cost increases on some? Maybe we'll have to pay more for some fuel, or we get some fuel for free from the sun, but we need to do investments. What's the co-benefits we're getting? To basically, what do you get them from realizing all of these benefits across each of the different options? But then, of course, it's all about putting that together into a holistic plan and say, this is how we're getting to zero. These are the investments we need by this date. These are the budget increases or budget decreases we can actually enforce due to changes in the structure, how we use energy across all sectors in the economy or organization, and you can basically apply this on any level. So I think that this is a very generic framework for how to make this very concrete and start to really enable the budget and the planning department to translate sustainability into investment plans and actual deep changes in organizations. And here we have an example where basically we went through the baseline investments, looked at what are some of the core options that you can do across New York. I'm not saying these are the ones that you should do. I'm saying these are the ones that you can do, and these are roughly then the emission reductions that can generate. And as you see, of course, big chunk around buildings decarbonization, electricity, and so on, and the very common areas. But then what is, of course, really important going from here is to say, okay, what's actually the additional investments we need across all of these areas? Who are the stakeholders that will actually do this? So that's basically, maybe it's a small chart, but these are basically the investments that you need to do. And then the question is, so if we do those investments, and a lot is talking, this transition will cost this and this much. But if we forget about the cost and savings that this actually would generate, we only talk about the large costs, and that is not helping anyone. We need to talk about the large savings this will generate. Because then we can see that this might actually be a positive economic investment for society. Might not be for each individual stakeholder, but for society as a whole, it's actually a positive transition. But then the question is, okay, how do you actually drive that? And that is a challenge, of course. Some will be losers, some will be winners. And that's where it becomes complicated. And for a city, I think it's super important to also talk about co-benefits. Reduced noise levels, reduced air pollution, increased activity levels, and so on, that also actually reduce costs for the healthcare system. And that in turn can also trigger additional climate action. So of course, this type of very detailed perspective then comes from, of course, a bottom-up understanding of what really needs to be done. And talking about that, of course, translating that to what we are here to discuss today, all of these investments, there are solutions that did not exist a couple of years ago, but they are really emerging across all of these sectors. So of course, across the whole transportation industry, we're having more and more electrification, but then also we need the fossil-free steel in each of the cars. We need to rebuild our buildings. We need to improve our heating systems. We need to decarbonize our electricity system. And we need to also think through our circular economy and how we address that and how we reduce emissions and also take care of our resources in a much better way. So of course, this is, in a way, coming back to the business opportunity that's here. And 30 billion might sound very small, but that also should be compared to the baseline investments we are anyway doing in all of this. So around 50 billion in new cars, trucks, and buses over 10 years. If we just divert those 50 billion from diesel trucks to electric trucks, we only need a little bit extra to do that transition. And I think that is the mindset. It's just a little bit extra. It's just more about shifting from what we're currently investing in to what we can invest in to lower emissions, and not only talk about the big challenge and the big cost. So I think that was from us to give a bit of a highlight. Thank you.
Right. You're not allowed to go. I'm going to go off script for a second, and I'm going to ask you just one question. Carolina, you talked about the physics of this, but actually your graphics made me think of chemistry. They made me think of the periodic table. And I've got a question, which is, you know, in the periodic table with all of its elements, part of the beauty of chemistry is the combination of elements. Have you looked at where there could be synergies and perhaps economic savings, emission benefits from certain investments that give you even more bang for your buck by acting together, acting and being combined? Because at the moment they're quite sort of, you know, in their own categories, but there must be some way of looking at the combination.
Yes, absolutely. So a couple of solutions. So for example, we have the whole digitalization trend. And if we take electrification of the truck fleet, for example, of course, when digitalizing logistics, you can also predict very much of how and when and do you charge and how do you set up the structure, so you can minimize the cost of batteries and you can make sure that you don't run out of range. So of course that is where really investments in digitalization is really supporting that transition. But then also we see that of course investments in buildings and heating can really offload some of the investments in decarbonizing electricity, where they can go hand in hand and support each other. And also when you electrify heating, you can also support the electricity grid with services. So you get actually lower cost of transitioning into a zero emission grid because you have much more flexible use of electricity and so on. So I think that there's a lot of things you can do jointly across many of these sectors.
Yeah, as I mentioned, what we help cities with over at Climate U is this platform. So obviously, as soon as you connect to a platform and you go digital, suddenly you can actually have an overview and a monitoring ability, not just on your city, but somehow you contribute to a network effect of data where you get that sort of pool of knowledge that goes beyond your city and actually can help in the future to inform the most effective pathways.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for going off script and answering my question. That was brilliant. Thank you. Robert concluded his presentation really by setting up the next section of our event, which is to look at evidence-based solutions to bridge the, see if I can, yeah, here we go. Evidence-based solutions to bridge the implementation gaps. And so we now have 3 panels that we're looking at different ways in which we're going to reduce New York City's decarbonization pathways. We're going to start off with a panel on enabling a zero-emission energy and fossil-free transportation system. And I shall invite our panelists to come up and take the stage. And then we're going to have a really great 20-minute blitz panel discussion. So first of all, may I welcome up onto the stage Ydanis Rodriguez, who is the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Transportation. Ydanis, you're very welcome. Also, Martin Edlund, who is the CEO of Minesto. And Jenny Cato, who is the Global Head of Public Affairs and Partnership at Scania. Welcome, Jenny. And last but not least, Martin Pay, who is the CTO, Chief Technology Officer of SSAB, the Swedish steel maker. Wonderful. Great to see you all. Welcome. I'm going to start off with you, Commissioner, if I may. And you've seen here, you've got a graphic here that gives you the green set of elements that are needed, perhaps, to enable this transition of the transport sector. And I just wonder whether you wanted to give us an insight into what you're already doing, what sorts of policies and investments you're already trying to put in place to deal with things like electrification, for example.
First of all, thank you to Camila and all the members of her team in the Chamber of Commerce. You know, New York City and Sweden have decades of working together, sharing ideas, as you say, many of the investments, you know, that we have in New York City also have resources coming also from your country. As you know, we live in a more independent world. It's about, here we are, you know, not only those of us who are for Sweden or New Yorkers, but visitors with the big responsibility to work together. One of the things that for me, as I listen to everyone, I want also everyone to remind some point stand here and think about like 10 miles from here, where we have the poorest congressional district in the United States, where we have a gap of those New Yorkers who live on the poverty lines, and then the other New Yorkers who are middle class and upper class. So one of the big responsibilities that we have as we make big plan is to invest in the human development. Because if we don't do that, I can tell you a lot of big projects that we are doing on the Mayor Adams administration, but we will not be able to change the new culture on how we have to reimagine the use of public space. So this is something that under this administration, Mayor Adams, myself as a commissioner, we take very seriously. It's about the inequality. How do we connect community? And yes, when we look on our goal, first of all, 80% of my job, as you know, DOT oversee 27% of the land in New York City. All the roadway, all the sidewalk, all the plaza, all the bridges, the ferry is on this agency. But the other responsibility is about engaging the public, about the conversation about can we reimagine the use of public space. We did a pilot project thinking about the last mile for UPS to Amazon and FedEx to be able to say, here we have this curb space where we can bring those trucks and thousands of boxes they can get there. But how can we use electric car? How can we use cargo bike to move those boxes from that curbside to those buildings? And the conversation cannot be about the UPS and the Amazon and the FedEx. It has to be about the human part. It's about 80% of New Yorkers and visitors who place an order once a week through those companies to get the product in their apartments. 22% of New Yorkers and visitors who place they order 4 times a week. So yes, we're doing a lot of work in the last cargo bike. We also are thinking about how can we go electric in our ferry. So here we have the Staten Island ferry. Most of you are familiar with that. But also we have a ferry that if you have not seen it or think about it or research, we have the largest public cemetery in the United States here in Hat Island. 1 million bodies being buried in that cemetery since 1613. So in that cemetery, we also use a ferry. That's going to be the first electric ferry on our fleet of ferry that will be electric. So, but also we're going into the bike lane and the bus lane. Last year, we had 200 million bike trips in New York City. Every day, there's 550,000 people using the bike. As the population is growing, I also had to challenge those individuals who say, we have those motor-powered scooters, we have those mopeds, they're in the sidewalk, we don't feel safe. So we have to engage in that conversation with the public to say, the largest numbers of cyclists, they do it the right way. They use their bike to go to work, to go to school, to have fun. That small percentage that are creating the trouble, they don't represent the majority. So it's about moving the products, moving people in a way that we're thinking about how we can go to zero, in this administration and for all the administrations to come. The message to the youngest one, we will not resolve this issue in the adult time. And Maria, Katrina, Sandy, all those natural disasters been happening in our time. And if we don't take responsibility, we will not be sure that the world will be safe for the future generation.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I think it's, fantastic examples. Set off with this critical framework of thinking about an equitable transition for the citizens of New York. Before I hand over to the next, I just have one very quick question, which might help these guys as well, which is, if there is a sort of set of solutions or partnerships with the private sector, with companies that you're looking for, can you give us sort of where do you need the private sector to come in and help you actually deliver the sort of transition you need?
I think it's about electric, and it's about moving people, in this case, through bike in the city of New York. I was born and raised in a Caribbean island, Dominican Republic. I came here at the age of 18. When I was born in 1965, my father had a bike. So the motor transportation at that time was horses, donkey, and a bike. However, working class people, for whatever reason, they thought that a car became a symbol of progress, and a bike was a symbol of poverty. I did my last semester in Shanghai, Food and Dash University, and when I was there, the first advice that I got was about change your dollars, get 350 yuan, go and buy a bike, and they have bike lane. So what we have seen in the city of New York right now is about the middle and upper class. The New Yorkers and visitors with a master, PhD, those with high level of education are the ones who know when you bike, it's good for your health, it's good for your environment, it's good for your economy. Then we have to push into those communities that are more car ownership cultural. They feel that as we go around the 5 boroughs and try to build that infrastructure to have more protected bike lane, to widen the bike lane so that also we can provide a space for the cargo bike to deliver the food. So I think that this big project, I would say, I don't want to focus on the big one, The big one is going to be for the private sector. Think about electric ferry. Think about how electric charge, automotive vehicle. But I want to focus on the small piece. It's about help us to change the culture on how we imagine the use of public space. And if we invest together, that will come with a return to you for your investment too.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I won't actually ask you this, but Martin, I'm really looking forward to the first zero carbon steel bicycle. So, you know, when's that going to be available for me to purchase? That would be amazing.
Yes, actually, we are right now putting on the market a steel product that is actually made here in the US by SSAB. We are running 2 steel mills here in US, one in Iowa, one in Alabama. Both are based on recycled scrap. And we just started to launch a product called SSB Zero. What does that mean? It means that with recycled scrap, counting Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions, we add 0.0 ton CO2 per ton steel we produce. How have we done that? We produce this in Iowa, where we have with Mid-American, the power company, that we secure 100% of renewable electricity. And we work with our partners sourcing biocarbon instead of fossil carbon that we use in our electric furnaces. And we use biogas in the process, so we phase out natural gas. That is certified, and we deliver EPDs to our customers. Now it's on the market. So it is possible to now get these commercial deliveries. And in addition to that, you all know that in Sweden we have developed the hybrid technology, where we are right now scaling it up. So in Sweden and Finland, we will phase out our current blast furnace-based technology as soon as possible. SSAB is really implementing the most aggressive transition program. We just made the investment decision in May this year, investing 6.2 billion Swedish crowns to phase out our first site using blast furnaces. We plan to invest 2 new, complete new steel mills, one in Luleå, one in Roa in Finland. So we will complete the transition, hopefully around 2030. We say around because we want to do it as fast as possible. But we are dependent on some permit processes that we don't know how fast it will make. So we are now really moving into this transition and hopefully as soon as possible deliver more steel products to our customers.
And can you link those steel products and the customers to the transport sector, perhaps initially, but there must be others as well, construction as well. So you're part of a value chain of solutions. Tell us more about that.
Sure. We have now from our research facility that have been running the hybrid pilot plant since 2020. It was not aimed as a production facility. We invested this heavily. So far, we have spent $200 million in R&D. But from that research facility, when we run the hybrid process using 100% hydrogen, we get this spon drying that we have used to make trial volumes of steel to our customers. And the first ones were delivered to Volvo Group, who made the trucks that have been shown and delivered to customers. Actually, there's one truck is delivered to a company here in the US. It's in operation. We have delivered trial volumes of products to many other, say, users. Transportation segment is, of course, one of the most important segments because there is the demand for this fossil-free steel is the highest. But also we recognize now that also the construction segment is the most heavy steel consuming segment, and that is also start moving. You think about in a building, you have ventilation systems, you have roofing, you have structure for high skyscrapers. It's a lot of steel that really can be decarbonized. Now we have shown that technology is developed. It's really the investment programs that we need to roll out.
So you're delivering solutions that begin to sort out some of those Scope 3 emission problems that the construction sector is facing.
Exactly.
one last question before I move on, if I can. Is there something that you need to be able to go faster?
Yeah, for SACP's case, because we are a steel company that have been in the business, our oldest production site is goes back to 1878 in the middle of Sweden. So we are a company with established customer base, and we are specialized in high-end, high-strength steel products. We have customers like Scania and Volvo, and really important customers. So we have a healthy business. We generate cash flow. So SSAB has been debt-free for several years. Our current gearing is negative. So we have the strength to make this investment program without asking customers for offtake agreements, because we don't need that. And we have the technology that we have developed together with our partners. So what is really limiting our speed for implementing this technology is factors that is not in our own control. It's mainly the permit process that we are struggling with.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'd like to move on now, if I can, to you, Jenny. Jenny, you're from Scania. You make electric vehicles, electric trucks and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about how, perhaps not only in the case of New York, but in mega cities, in cities in general, what sort of solutions are you able to deliver to help them meet their climate goals?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on this panel. Yeah, so we're a global truck and bus manufacturer, and since I have the microphone now, I can say we make one of the world's best trucks. And we have for a long time. We're a 130-year-old company. We're now in the most disruptive transition of all times. I mean, since we went from horse and carriage to combustion engine, this is the next kind of disruptive transition at the moment. And we are already serial producing battery electric trucks, trying also to make them the world's best, of course, for urban usage. So that is already an off-the-shelf product, actually. We have production. We are present in 100 countries. We have production on 3 continents. And of course, cities is a major driving force, because cities are easiest to decarbonize, I would say. A long haul is more difficult, because you need a charging infrastructure and a network that is much more challenging. So cities has that advantage. And also, there is some powerful tools that cities can use, like public procurement, for example, using that power in order to actually purchasing green transportation and green vehicles. But of course, there are still challenges all over. But that is kind of the basis of it.
Tell us about one or two of those challenges quickly before we move on.
Yeah, I mean, as you also were into, I mean, of course, we need charging infrastructure even in cities, even though 85% of the charging will be happening on depot or destination. So that is easier in that sense. But still, for that, there needs to be land permits, and it also needs to be permits for the grid extensions. You need a capacity, of course. You need the green electricity, because, of course, the battery electric trucks only make sense if you have access to green or renewable or fossil-free, at least, electricity. So there are still challenges. And, of course, we also need the whole ecosystem. I mean, the battery electric truck is still more expensive than the conventional truck, of course. And we need incentives and policy measures in order to kind of make it price parity or have the TCO, even though it's more, I mean, it's cheaper to operate a BEV truck in the long run.
Thank you, Jenny. TCO, total cost of ownership.
Sorry, exactly.
No, just helping everybody navigate here. Now, I can see that Martin's dying to get in because we mentioned energy and renewables and stuff like that. But I'm not going to let you. You're going to have to just wait I've got one last question for Jenny, actually. Jenny, you'll remember from when Robert was talking about co-benefits.
Yes.
And I'd really, because I think this is something that I experience as a cyclist, which is if you are going to change to electrification, you deal with some issues around air pollution. Great, that's one co-benefit. But what about the remaining sort of disbenefit of congestion? What can you do to help us deal with the traffic, which we're all experiencing here in New York at the moment?
Yeah, and that is also talking about the last mile connectivity and that whole thing. So, of course, I mean, with the battery electric truck, the first thing is that it's quiet, so you can actually operate it during nighttime. So off-peak deliveries, both for goods and for waste collection, for example, that we do already in Copenhagen and in Stockholm. So that would kind of, let the pressure off of daytime usage, and then in that sense help congestion. It also have co-benefits in terms of air pollution, because of course a battery electric truck does not emit any other harmful substances. So I mean, there is things to do. We can also work with transport efficiency, like loading the trucks in different ways. So the fuller the truck gets, the less trucks you need. And also using city hubs around the city and making that last mile connectivity, the last mile delivery in a better way, so that we get not so many trucks stuck in traffic in the cities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm going to hand over to Martin now, if I may. Over to you. Pick up. Oh, you've got a mic already. Oh, excellent. Look at him there. He's ready to go.
Two Martin here.
Sorry. So, from Minesto. Martin, I think we need perhaps a brief introduction about how Minesto can really help to deliver a technology, an innovative technology that can help us decarbonize the energy system. Tell us about it.
Yes, I can do that. It's a bit tempting to ruin the party here and say that everything that we're trying to do with electrification and transport, that, well, no point if we don't get completely renewable energy systems to fuel and feed this whole system. And I represent a company, Minesto, that is one of the new renewable energy technologies or innovations. So we harvest the energy from ocean currents and tidal currents. And then you might think, why bother with that? We have solar and wind. But I think that the big challenge is that we need electricity all the time. We need electricity when we need to consume it. And by expanding the energy mix, by adding the ocean renewables, we get plannable energy, we get base load type of renewables. Those solutions exist. And I think that's sort of the non-ruin in the party dimension of it, that it's just a matter of getting those energy sources to feed our cities into it. And I think this is where a connection between the renewable transition on the energy side and larger cities can make sense. Because some of those investments that we're talking about, some of those solutions that you offer, offers synergies to the investments of the somewhat more expensive renewable energy solutions in the first phase. And one big example here is, I mean, you can talk about the smart city in general, that it can be more flexible in its energy consumption. But I think the installed capacity of storage that comes with electrification of transport, I mean, we'd make that investment to get the trucks and the cars to move in the city, but they are also an extremely good source to absorb energy from intermittent and not fully plannable renewable energy sources. And if you think through that again, you may even end up in a situation where you get more bang for the buck by moving in that direction than keep consuming the fossils. So we will keep flying our underwater dragons to be a part of supporting the system in that sense.
And that's great, Martin, thank you. Yes, because you're using tidal energy, and that's where your dragons are flying within the tidal energy. Have you got any examples of how you might envisage your technology being used in a city context?
Yes, it's easier in smaller cities. So we are in the Faroe Islands in a city with, maybe not a city, 30,000 people, but there they can offer the consumers to guarantee the electric car charged in the morning with tidal energy. We have 4 production peaks over the season. So they own production capacity all the way to the meter. So they can say to the consumer, when you park your car at night, we guarantee you that the tank will be full, the battery will be charged by the morning when you need it. So by adding those sort of intelligent components to the infrastructure, using that renewable source where you are guaranteed to produce every night, then you have a system where you do not need additional expensive storage or overcapacity investments in other types of renewables. So that's perhaps one example.
A great example, thank you very much. I can tell you that those of you who are in New York, please go and actually experience these amazing solutions that SSAB and Minesto have presented today, because they are being shown live just a couple of blocks up on 3rd Avenue. So I think it's called the Action Speaks Summit is where you'll find those things. So do take a look at them. a big hand, a big thank you to this fantastic panel. Wonderful. And now we're going to move on to our second panel. And our second panel, we're going to be looking at towards how we move towards sustainable material consumption in a net zero environment. It's a great pleasure again to invite 4 fantastic panelists to the stage. I shall introduce them for you, give them a warm hand. So first of all, we have Suzanne de Roche, who is the VP of Clean and Resilient Buildings at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. A very warm welcome, Suzanne. Hi there. Then we have Per Larschans, who is the Director of Sustainability at Ragn-Sells. Per, warm welcome. And then Mer Kaplan, who is Vice President of Sustainability in the United States for Skanska. And finally, Per Hedebeck, who is the CEO of iBinder. Wonderful. Thank you very much, guys. When I was listening to the presentation that Carolina and Robert were giving, I was sort of going, ooh, that red one, that red bit is pretty big. Must be pretty tough to deal with it, I would have thought. But I'm really glad that we're going to be hearing from you about the sorts of solutions that we can introduce. But I'd really like to start off with you, Suzanne, if I may. And perhaps you just want to just tell us a little bit about what it is that you and your department does, especially in the context of some pretty ambitious targets that the city has set itself.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Great to be here today. Nice to see some familiar faces in the audience as well. Hey, more familiar faces. So I'm Suzanne DeRoche, and I work at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So really, we are both the state's energy office as well as kind of a catalyst for the state's climate goals. The state has a very ambitious 85% reduction target by 2050, so lots of head nodding. Very ambitious renewable energy and clean energy goals. But we're here to talk about materials, so I thought I would focus a little bit on that. One of the roles of the Clean and Resilient Buildings team is really to look across the industry and see where financial support, technical assistance, changes in codes, those types of things can really move towards the climate goals. And so when we look at materials in general, we're focused a lot on reuse and adapt. We're focused on programs that support a reduction of high intensity materials, as well as designers using embodied carbon life cycle cost analysis. The state did issue an executive order last year that will require, starting October 1st, which is right around the corner, that design teams do design teams for state projects do life cycle cost analysis, and as well, we just issued a press release today that basically mandates the use of low carbon concrete. So the state is really, yes, that was exciting. I was like, it came out 15 minutes before I got here, so I got to talk about it a little bit, and more guidance to follow. So that's just gives you a kind of broad brush strokes of what we're working on at the state.
That's amazing. Great news about the this new mandate, because I do think that we've heard a little bit about how important it is for policy to have a playing field that then the companies and businesses can innovate towards and then hopefully get there in terms of commercial production.
That's right.
Let me turn now to you, Pat, if I may. So, Pat, you're working at Ragn-Sells, and I know a lot of what you do is related to sort of nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, which are critical for food production. But we've now begun to see that there's a possibility that this is going to be a backlash. We've got a problem where phosphorus is going to be actually a major problem for us. Can you tell us about the sorts of solutions that you've got to deal with the P problem, the phosphorus problem?
Yeah, it was a New York journalist that in
February published an article that said that phosphorus saved our way of life. Now it threatens to take it. Why? Because we have too much phosphorus in the wrong place, in our seas, in our rivers, and it causes problems like eutrophication. In March, I had the honor to be here in New York, and I then moderated a session at the UN Water Conference about phosphorus. And I had a telephone call afterwards with an invitation if I could do a podcast together with Elizabeth Colbert, the writer of the article. And it was published yesterday, so I will not go into the details, but the big thing was when I landed in New York, I put on ABC. And ABC News was really very clear. Sorry, people in Florida, this year you will not be able to take your spring bath in the ocean, because the risk is too high that you have cyanobacteria in the ocean, because we have the biggest algae bloom ever in the Sargasso Sea, because too much phosphorus and nitrogen in the Atlantic. So not even the Atlantic is big enough to absorb it going forward. So I think that is really one of the big challenges.
And we know that New York is a megacity. It's been perhaps the first megacity in the world in about 1950s, if we want to sort of go back that far. One of the great challenges, and we heard about from the commissioner about how important it is to be able to move people, but also produce. One of the things about a city is that, at least I can't see out of this window, so much sort of produce, food being produced here. You've got to bring it into the city. But you know, how are we going to deal with the situation where a megacity needs to be producing, well, actually bringing that food in? How have you got solutions there that can really help the megacities?
Yes, let me bring it to 2050. 70% of the global population will live in cities, and we'll have 10 billion people on the planet. What we need to do then is to make sure that today's megacities, today's cities, will become the future mine of the resources when named phosphorus and nitrogen. So today, we take the nitrogen from the atmosphere, causing huge. I think we need to use 2% of the world's energy just to produce the nitrogen fertilizer today. And the phosphorus, of course, will be more and more scarce. And without phosphorus, no life. That's exactly where we come in. We have the innovations to produce nitrogen fertilizer directly from the wastewater that will reduce the cost for the city of New York substantially and generate an income. And of course, everybody that knows chemistry knows that if you take away the nitrogen molecule, you will then have a much more production of biogas. So there will be much more income as well for the city. So in the future, we need to make sure that cities are today's resource plants. And here, right now, we are now launching our 10 billion challenge. So if you go into 10billionchallenge.org, we are now inviting companies around the world to come up with their solutions. How can we make sure that cities are the future mine?
And Per, I know that you're holding something there in your hand, which looks like it might be something you'd like to present, a solution perhaps even.
Exactly, and this is one of the examples that we can extract after we're taking up the phosphorus from the sewage sludge, and of course taking out the other elements that are important. We have a leftover, and that leftover can replace cement in concrete productions. So this is an example of what we're produced from poo, but no longer poo. It's a very low zero emission product that is used in buildings. And of course, going forward, we like to paint the city of New York also with poo. In this case, red poo, red color. It's also produced from leftovers, so from after we've taken out everything else. So today's problem, we know that the city of New York has huge problems what to do with the sewage sludge. We can bring back everything as valuable resources in the future.
Brilliant, Per. Thank you very much. So you've managed to present some amazing circular solutions here, solutions that are really addressing this resource and material consumption and trying to reduce it. But also, I love this idea of turning the city into a mine, the source of some of the materials that we need in the future. But circularity is something that I think we're going to pick up again with you, Mer, if I can. So you're working with Skanska. Skanska is, a developer and a constructor of buildings. What are the sorts of things that you've got to offer to make sure that we can be as efficient in our material consumption and use in cities like New York?
Well, gosh, that's a big question. So one thing that we did, and I'm just going to start with the whole carbon conversation, because circularity, to me, looking for those opportunities to engage products that have already been used and introduce them into a different project or product, definitely. To me, the best product is one that is not virgin extracted from the earth, right? So that makes a lot of sense from the carbons, and I'll come back to that in a second. From the carbon perspective, we seed funded and co-developed the EC3 tool, the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator tool, which is open source and has been since 2019. We rolled that out with a software developer we worked with, and the Carbon Leadership Forum as our partner. And the reason I bring that up, and I've talked about it before, and certainly it's been in print for a while, it has become such a good monster. It's gone from a little monster to a global monster. The nonprofit that's leading it now is actually seeing a huge uptick in EPDs, environmental product declarations, coming in from Australia. As well, it has now expanded into Europe. And so what I'm trying to say here is that, that whole concept around globalization, the concept around, my climate is your climate, my carbon is your carbon. The best way that we could see in 2018, when we started that process of creating the tool, was to reduce carbon. Well, everyone's talking about carbon, but carbon isn't the only thing that we're concerned about. It really has to be holistic. It has to include things like poop. I can't believe I just said that. And last year I was on this stage this very stage with Stephen Jordan, talking about, what it would mean to take these buildings that are here, take future buildings that will be here, and make them living building challenge level. And within those types of projects, we're doing net positive water, and it's to such an extent that the municipal waste that comes from that building is treated fully on site and brought back as drinking water, and the waste used as fertilizer and other things. So there's a number of ways, I won't take up all the time here, but a number of ways that we're working with project level solutions like that, but also working with like the concrete industry on the replacement of cement with those admixtures that are out there, some of which are actually stronger than cement, besides bringing down your carbon footprint. So things like glass pozzolan, porcelain pozzolan, and other admixtures that really are game changers in terms of, the cement is 80% of the problem in terms of the carbon. So.
Thank you very much, Matt. Before we hand over, I've got a two-pronged question to you, because I saw you applauding when you heard Suzanne say that she's just launched this press release announcing a new standard. Is that the way to? A requirement, yeah. My two-pronged question is, the first is, what difference is that going to make to you in your business? And the second one is it just the start? What else would you like Suzanne to do to really help you?
I mean, we're already working with EDC and other government entities here in New York on circularity, on how we can deploy something like the Life Cycle Building Material Center that we co-founded in Atlanta, here in New York, looking for those opportunities to share resources across competitors, across projects. It's huge. I mean, it really is huge, the announcement. And the reason is that any architect will tell you that this is a kind of a domino effect, that it takes the weight off of them to try and argue the specification of low carbon concrete. And sometimes that can be very challenging for them to make the case. And it's not because of cost premium, it's because frankly, we've done studies with Rocky Mountain Institute and determined that the majority of the time, there is not a cost premium on choosing lower carbon concrete. The issue is a lot of misperception around the structural integrity of going with lower carbon concrete. And for whatever reason, we can be out there educating people every single day, and they still often are thinking, oh no, it still has to be cement.
It's really interesting just to hear that the question of acceptance of some of these solutions has come back again. It was there in our first panel as well. The Commissioner referred to it. Let me move on now to Per Hedebeck from iBinder. Per, what can iBinder do to help New York City have a more sustainable material consumption?
Well, before answering that question, I will share some facts and numbers, which many of you maybe already know. But if you look into this construction and real estate industry, it stands for 40% of the world's CO2 emission. 50% of all extracted resources goes to this industry as well, and about 35% of all waste is generated from the industry. And of course, if you look into New York as a city, probably the most expensive city to live in the world, especially for poor Swede like now. You will also find some of the most expensive buildings in the world in this city. And of course, you have a high value of these buildings when they are standing, but when you tear them down, it becomes negative or a cost. And now back to the question you're asking. So what iBinder do, we help property owners to understand the value in their buildings. Because if you don't know if you have toxic material that need to be taken care of in a specific way, or if you can reuse or recycle a material. So within iBinder, we consider these buildings as banks, where the currency is not money, but we see that there is a lot of valuable material that can be used in a much, much better way compared to what we're doing today.
And you're dealing in data, essentially, in that case. And data is now becoming a key way of understanding that sort of sustainability footprint and how you manage it all. But you're currently a leader in Nordics. What do you think that you can sort of take from the Nordic experience and bring here in to New York City? What sort of learnings can you pass on?
Well, I think if you look into the Nordic region, where I think Sweden is the leader, of course I need to say that. That is actually the most competitive region in the world in terms of compliance, a lot of new laws, regulation, pushing sustainability. We actually have a higher productivity in the sector, maybe because of Skanska and other good companies, and also a lot of good productivity. And we have operation, we have been there successfully for more than 20 years. And in some of these areas, we are regarded as an industrial standard. So of course, I think there is a lot of good lessons learned that we are happy to share with the US and any other country, by the way. So.
Fantastic. So there's plenty of solutions, real world ones here. There's your 10 billion challenge.
10billionchallenge.org.
Fantastic. We've got wonderful news about this ability to use low carbon concrete, generating acceptance and really implementation. And then we have the data solutions that are going to help people manage their buildings and understand them as a bank. I like that. It's a fantastic image. With that, I think a warm hand and thank you to this fantastic panel.
Thank you.
So that theme of data is going to continue into our third and final panel for today. Again, a huge, great pleasure to be able to invite 4 new panelists up to the stage. And we'll start with Isabella Brown, who is the Senior Climate Policy Advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. A very warm welcome, Isabella. We have Christian Rönn, who is CEO of Normative. Christian, welcome. Then Carl-Johan von Yxkull, who is CCO at Duconomy. Welcome. And finally, Johan Börje, who is Head of Voluntary Carbon Market Sales at Stockholm Exergy. Welcome, all 4 of you. Great to have you all here today. Christian, would you mind passing the mic over to Isabella? Isabella, I'd love to start with you, if I may. Can you tell us as this panel, I'll just read the title of this panel so we can just see what we're talking about here. Enabling data-driven emission reduction strategies and carbon markets. Pretty broad, covering quite a lot of angles here, but we're going to start off with more the sort of data side of things, the side of things that are around sort of accounting for and creating inventory. So I'm going to ask you, start off with that if I can, Isabella, and tell us a little bit about the role that New York City's greenhouse gas inventory is playing in developing the sorts of policies that are going to deliver on your targets for 2030 and mid-century as well.
Definitely. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. You know, New York City has a long history of developing and utilizing its greenhouse gas inventory to push policies. We have been accounting for emissions as far back as 2005. And as you sort of mentioned at the beginning here, one of the first things we saw was that, you know, 70% of our emissions are related to buildings and building energy usage, which is something that we've all been talking about a lot today. You know, we can see the path from that moment of accounting for building emissions in 2005 to today, when we are about to, you know, implement Local Law 97, which is a massive and very ambitious building emission regulation occurring here in New York City. You know, from that point in 2005, we, you know, started collecting data on building energy usage, building energy audits, and through that data and through that usage, we built out Local Law 97. And it has been an intensive data approach to that. If anybody knows about Local Law 97, it is not the easiest law to understand. There's a lot of calculations involved to try to estimate and put a price on the carbon of our building emissions. You know, that pathway has proved so fruitful, and we're really starting to see such, you know, as we've talked about, we're right at the forefront of implementing that. That law comes into effect next year in 2024. And we've seen such a massive shift. You know, we're at the implementation point. We're now taking that pathway and we are starting to implement it with other things. You know, we talked a lot about embodied carbon in the last panel. Our office is heavily involved in pushing, you know, we push the Clean Construction Executive Order. We're heavily involved in the life cycle assessments and, you know, low carbon concrete that's involved in that executive order, and we're starting to incorporate that into our inventory efforts. I could go on forever. There's so many other assets of our inventory, but we really do ground everything in the data first, and we use that to push the city council to make sure that those laws are actually actionable and can be represented in our inventory.
Fantastic, thank you. Some great examples of how you're taking the data to inform policy, to inform this Local Law 97 and the future direction of those policy making is great. Sorry, there was something that really struck me when you said about the way that you've been using all of this to develop an economic, essentially a cost of carbon for this. Can you tell us a little bit? Because I mean, this was something that Robert and Christina were talking about. How do you do this? The emissions to the economics.
Right. I mean, you know, this wasn't, I think, the most notable part about Local Law 97, but it does, in fact, put a cost on carbon. You know, there's I'm going to have the number wrong, but I won't say the number, but a cost per each ton of carbon that a building creates. There was a ton of work that went in actually into, you know, some of the you know, the pathway assessments that went into, and the technical working groups that New York City did that went into building up Local Law 97. Just to touch on it, we also are embarking on a massive climate budgeting effort through our Office of Management and Budget. That effort will attempt to, again, put a cost of carbon on all of the capital planning processes that happen through our city. And we're sort of embarking on trying to estimate the risk and climate and resiliency impacts that are also associated with those efforts. So it's not just carbon, it's a host of other indicators that we have to look at.
Can you tell us just finally a little bit about, cities are intricately connected to sort of wider economies. So what about trying to make sure that what you're doing, even if it doesn't feature in your city level sort of accounting and inventories, but is actually having an effect in the sort of broader economy in the state or in the country as a whole?
Yeah, definitely. So this last April, we put out a consumption-based inventory. And not only did we just look at, for those of you that don't know, consumption-based inventory is really looking at all the emissions associated with manufacturing, transporting, and distributing all the things that we consume here in the city. And we went even a step farther, really, to look at integrating that into our inventory. So not just saying, here are the consumption-based emissions, here's our geographical inventory, but where can we find the overlaps in those? And that really helps us see, what do we have jurisdiction over? What can we sort of start planning policies around? One of those things is embodied carbon. Another is, passenger private vehicle transportation. Another one of those is food-related emissions, which is something that is a big point for our mayor, and something that we've pushed really hard on. We found that, when we put all these things together, food-related emissions are the third largest source of emissions in the city. And so through that, even though, we are not planning or have any plans to regulate the type of food that people eat in the city, we are going to use this information to inform people, to grow public-private partnerships, and really to make sure that people know that what they eat, has impacts.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Isabel. That sounded incredibly cutting edge in terms of how you combine all of these different perspectives of data. I saw Christian nodding quite a lot during what you were saying, and I'm sure you've got plenty to talk about in terms of how to make sure that the sort of strategies are credible when using data. Can you tell us about how Normative it can help people do that? Please, Christian.
So I was nodding because you mentioned consumption-based footprint, because obviously, and I think that is something that you will talk about a lot about more when you talk about the economy. But there is also, I think, in the city of New York, being the epicenter of finance, the emissions, the indirect emissions from that financial industry. And we actually did a study at Normative last year at COP, where we looked at 1,000 companies that have net zero targets. And combined, those companies are responsible for almost 80% of global emissions in their value chain and supply chain. And that's just 1,000 companies. We have 15,000 companies right now with some sort of net zero target. So that means that if all of those companies actually succeed with their targets, like we are solving climate change, and it sounds a little bit too good to be true, right? And it is, because it is. It is too good to be true, because most enterprises at the moment are failing with their net zero targets. And the main mode of failure is in the value chain and supply chain. So over 90% of emissions for an average enterprise is located in that supply chain. And right now, companies don't have the data. They don't have the data from the suppliers to even know what to do and how to incentivize them to reduce emissions. So what we're doing at Normative is carbon emissions accounting for enterprises and enterprise value chains. So we start by analyzing every single invoice that are the basis of the P&L of the business and say, okay, let's estimate what are the overall emissions, both in your own operations from electricity or vehicle fleets and so on, but quite crucially in the value chain. But that is just a first estimation. What we have launched now recently is that ability to engage with your value chain. And we're seeing huge adoption numbers where more than 50% of suppliers that are being asked actually provide carbon data and report that back. So in the context of the city of New York, what I think is really interesting is how can we sort of engage that financial industry to set net zero targets that would then trickle down to all of the enterprises and create the right incentives to decarbonize those value chains. Because if that happens, we can actually solve this.
Thank you very much, Christian. Before we move on, I would like to ask a question about what the sort of next frontier might be. I mean, you've launched some new ways of doing this, looking into engaging with the value chain. But what's the next frontier? Is it around even greater levels of accuracy, or is it sort of real-time data? What do you see as being the next frontier?
I think firstly, the next frontier is to get data from that supply chain. Because if you just estimate emissions, you don't know what to do in order to reduce emissions. So a lot of those emissions will be, electricity and core industrial processes. It will be buildings and cement and steel and so on. But then around that data, data in it of itself is pretty useless. And I run a data company, so I feel ashamed for saying it. But, unless you can build an ecosystem around that data where you have solutions for fossil-free steel, where you invest in nature, but also creating the right incentives. So that's why we're building this ecosystem together with some of the world's largest insurance companies to figure out how can we actually integrate carbon into insurance premiums to incentivize decarbonization. Same thing with banks. Basically, how can we give the right incentives for low interest, sustainability-linked loans for actually that reduction to happen in those global value chains? So to summarize, I think it's about having the right data, invite the suppliers to engage, but then secondly, building an ecosystem around that data for real solutions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Christian. And I think what you've laid out there really speaks to some of the tracks of the Ambition Summit that the UN Secretary General is hosting. It's all about making sure that all of the ambition that's out there is credible, but it can be implemented by actually having the right data through your value chain. Fantastic. Thank you very much. We're going to take a different perspective, perhaps, on data. And turn to you if I can.
No, sure. And it's interesting because Christian has, the other side of the coin. We are more coming from this citizen's perspective and trying to activate the consumers. And we believe that banks will play a key role, as in the case of Christian here, to drive that educational effort and that activation effort. And we see, talking about New York as a center, clearly there are a lot of big banks here, and that's also part of the reason why we are here this week, to making sure that we capitalize on the, I think, emerging interest among North American banks at this point in time. Europe, we're pretty early off in terms of, where banks saw that, call it a role in the whole climate education piece. And we see things happening here pretty quickly and things waking up here. And that is obviously, it's a very, very interesting time for us all in this space right now, I think.
Can you give us some examples of how the sorts of data that you can work with are actually inducing change by consumers and behavioral change, for example?
Yeah, so it starts with trying to create a language that consumers understand. So what does actually 10 tons of carbon mean? It's really hard to relate to, and we are trying to educate consumers to get that language. And to us, it's not necessarily about, scientifically perfectly correct calculations. Clearly at one point in time, that might take 5 to 10 years, 20 years before we can approach, that scientifically absolutely correct number. But at the end, that is not what will make the difference. At the end, you need the consumer to have something to relate to. We talk about all these studies. We made a study here in North America where we have figured out that 53% of American consumers would like to understand their carbon footprint. Okay, that's a great starting point. We can help with that. And then secondly, 78%, and this might bring some ideas as to where the role that the bank will play. And Åsa mentioned nudging as an example. So the bank can help with their product set to do nudging of consumers and making sure to drive the activation from that piece. But at the end, it's not, there is no silver bullet, as we all have been discussing, right? But rather finding all these various players to play a role in driving the activation.
Do you see a future also? We talked about quite a lot from the sort of perspective of activating the consumer, educating, getting them to understand the effect of their choices. Do you see a role in the future for the data that you're working with to help banks make an offer, whether it's a savings offer, an investment offer to consumers as well?
That happens today. Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah. Great. Well, look, I'm going to move us on to our final panelist, Johan Börje, who is from Stockholm Exergy. Great to have you here. Johan, I know that you work with carbon markets. Can you just tell us just incredibly briefly what you're doing at Stockholm Exergy, please?
Well, we do a lot at Stockholm Exergy. So we are an energy company in Stockholm, owned 50% by the city of Stockholm and 50% by some pension funds, Sweden and international. And we are primarily responsible for the heating and cooling of Stockholm. So we are the largest district heating provider in Sweden. And thus we have multiple energy units, primarily to provide heat and cooling, but also electricity. And this gives us a wonderful opportunity to get engaged in this sector with removals. So I kind of represent the last mile, the last 10 to 15%. How are our societies actually going to handle them? How do we actually get to this net zero? We have 2,000 companies claiming net zero, and as a matter of fact, they cannot get rid of those last emissions. What do we do about them? And our job is try to solve that. And we're currently constructing we haven't yet, we're planning, I should say. We're just about to take the final investment decision. What will be the largest permanent carbon removal plant in the world when it's ready by 2027? And we will be removing 800,000 tons of carbon. And nations and corporations will need that to get to net zero.
Fantastic. Okay, so you've got something to help them get that last little bit of the way towards being truly net zero. If you put this, the whole of our discussion here today is also preparing us. This is a stop on the way to COP28. And COP28, of course, is, if you like, the home of the Paris Agreement. And under the Paris Agreement, we've got a framework where carbon markets, trading in these sorts of emission removals, if you like, can really help to help us meet those global goals, stay in alignment with 1.5 degrees. Can you tell us a little bit about what you see as being the role of the carbon market and actually the role of this Article 6 of the Paris Agreement? Get into the nerdy weeds here. What role does that have to play, and how can you help?
So there's so much going on, and I think we're going through a phase where we are now getting serious about carbon markets. So if you look into the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, who is defining the Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, they are revising now what is Scope 2 going to mean in the future. Can we really deal with guarantees of origin and claim that we have zero carbon in the electricity usage? That has come under tremendous criticism because in reality you're just shuffling around. And we're bringing in removals to the accounting, land removals, geological permanent removals, the type of removals that we are working with. How should we count that? And are land removals really permanent? Probably not, but geological are to be considered permanent. And then we take that into the Article 6 discussions, of course, and now removals are being defined also in Article 6. And we have the famous question of how should governments or nations relate to corporations? And there is a very heated debate. And I think we need to come to grips with the fact that removals are initially quite expensive. We're going to need partnership, co-funding between governments and corporations willing to fund. And we also need to crack the nut how companies can then claim that and in becoming net zero. Because without these removals, all these 2,000 corporations will not become net zero. So we're going through a very important and exciting phase. And I guess my message to this audience in general is that there will not be a very high supply initially on the permanent removals. So we will see a quite dramatic phase going into 2030 and 2040 when all these 2,000 corporations have said, oh, we're going to be net zero, figuring out there are no removals on the market or they are becoming very expensive. So I think corporations should start to engage and think very carefully, how do they actually secure the permanent removals in 2030? If that is the plan, well, in 2040 there is a little bit more time, but not that much if you see what's in the pipeline of different plants now being planned and built.
Fantastic. I cannot resist but go back to you, Isabella, because I'm just wondering whether the New York City has looked into the question of removals and looked into that in relation to the sort of inventories that you have. Where does it fit into your policy making?
Definitely. I mean, I think it's something that comes up when you get into the nitty-gritty. I mean, we've reached similar conclusions. There's going to be a subset that's just is nearly impossible to decarbonize at this point. I think it's something that we weigh. You know, our biggest priority is to see carbon reductions happen in New York City. We want those benefits for our community, but we also need to make things possible. And I think to come back to 97, you know, that's an area where, you know, there is a possibility. There is, yeah, a possibility to see RECs, to see carbon markets sort of play a role. And I think there's been a lot of speculation about that. And you know, we're supportive of that as long as we see those benefits in our community. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. And a warm hand again to this final panel. Thank you very much. So we're now into the home straight of today's event. We now have an amazing intervention, a glimpse into the future, no less, of what New York City might be like in 2050. We're going to hear a live reading of a science-based story of one possible future for New York City in 2050, which has been prepared by Planethon. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. They've crafted a science-based future story of New York City, and it focuses on the transformation of the city to net zero and beyond. It's an example of what a city might experience and might reach in that transformation. And we have a fantastic person to come and read out and perform this scenario for us, and it's Hannah Dorr. Hannah, please take the stage. Hannah is an artist, an educator, and a producer. You're currently working at the New York City's PBS station on children's media. And I just want to say that today in your work, you're committed to storytelling that sparks wonder, forwards justice, and deepens compassion. Over to you.
I am New York City 2050, and this is my body. Today I stand before you to tell you what my body is becoming, how I am transforming. I am New York City 2050, and this is my spine, my bones, my limbs, my flesh. I am more agile. I have new materials throughout my body fused to the old. New parts of my body grow inspired by nature with green steel and regenerative materials. I am defined by my buildings, densely packed together. As some crumble or are replaced, their bones and tissue are reused to renew other parts of my body. The High Line was a prototype. Now it is a role model, one of many. My tens of millions get around smoother, quieter, shifting between modes of transport effortlessly. Living, loving, moving alone and together. I'm a city that is transforming to make life better. I'm becoming an athlete, sprinting into the future. In decarbonizing myself, I want more. I am New York City 2050, and this is how my lifeblood moves and circulates. I took from others. What I gave them in return was waste, trash, sewage. I didn't ask what they were supposed to do with it. I looked away whilst they buried it all in all its toxicity, pretending it no longer existed. Now, I keep as much as I can in my own system. I break things apart, burn some cleanly, and find new uses for the rest. My tens of millions share with each other, reuse, recycle, repair, lease, and loan. Poisons used to circulate in my body and then get expelled. Now they are extracted, made harmless. What I put into my body comes out different and mostly better. What carbon is left lurking around, I suck up, remove. I am New York City 2050, and this is how I protect myself and my tens of millions. I used to be terrified of rain, of flooding, of extreme heat. I feared being overwhelmed. In my fear, I started to build a wall to keep everything out. Now, I let the water in when it comes. I have unclogged the blue arteries that run through me, helping water like air flow through my body. My roads and sidewalks absorb the water, which is redirected to feed the trees that grow in my parks and plants that cool my roofs. All this green life shades my tens of millions, cleans our air. Others helped me by financing my immune system. I face extremes every year, but my system is already adapting. Transformation is underway. I am New York City 2050, and this is how I sense and make sense. I see and feel everything. My brain instantly knows what is going on in my other organs, muscles, limbs. I have a mega brain for my mega city nature. My tens of millions and I know how and when to intervene to make things better. I know where we need to invest in ourselves to make progress, accelerate change, help those in need, see where vulnerabilities exist, and reallocate resources. I am old, but my brain is new. I am a cyborg ecosystem. My tens of millions and I live in a world of new connections. I am New York City 2050, and this is how my metabolism works. I consumed so much energy, wasted so much. Now I generate more than we use. We generate energy together in districts across our 5 boroughs and warm our homes from the waste of what we eat, gathered every day by a network of electric autonomous vehicles that find their way through the arteries of my body and take the waste to go where it needs to become energy. Kites surf in the tides, blades whir offshore, creating energy. My tens of millions live in many different types of homes, spaces that are warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. My tens of millions now pump and transform heat to cool and cool to heat, rather than condition air with the fuel of dead dinosaurs. When a crisis strikes, my energy still flows, renewable, distributed, decentralized. I am New York City 2050. And as I wrap up, this is my beating heart. As I have walked my transition pathway, I have embodied justice and fairness. I know that if my tens of millions are to thrive, I must change to be there for all of them. Together, we have led the way on better ways to live with low emissions. We have sparked the biggest collab in human history. My sibling cities have joined us. We are racing together. Experimenting and implementing, I am ambitious and accountable. I am a city that thinks like a planet. I am a smart and green city. I am a place for cultures coming and melting together. Many of you, right here, right now, are working tirelessly to bring my future into existence. Thanks to the scientists who pointed out what was happening to me and what needed to be done about it. Thanks to the innovators and creative souls for the ideas and innovations bold enough to make a real difference. Thanks to the leaders for having courage and taking the actions that have enabled solutions. In my future, we have made it happen. We have shown that it was possible to transition. We have embraced urgency, faced challenges, and created opportunities. From right here, right now, to my future. We are pioneering the possible. I am New York City 2050. I am Manhattan.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Planet On. Our first panel, the Commissioner called for a radical reimagination of public space, and you've delivered. Thank you. We're going to finish off now with some concluding remarks and reflections towards COP28 and beyond, and I'm very proud to be able to present Ulrike Modea, who is the UN's Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP. Ulrike, the floor is yours.
Thank you. That was something, a city to long for, and I hope it includes Brooklyn as well, where I live, not only Manhattan. And indeed, a bit of a difficult task to come after this, but I would really like also on behalf of UNDP, one of the UN agencies with presence really across the world in 170 of our member states, to give you the opportunity to think what we could do together ahead of COP, during COP, but not least also onwards. So thanks to Business Sweden and the Consulate General of Sweden in New York for the opportunity to speak here, even though I stand in between you and a sunny evening in New York. What we would like to share with you are actually also some of the potential that is out there and that we also heard about in I Am New York 2050, This Is My Body. Because of course we know, and you know in this room, that cities are really central to countries, to the national pledges, to achieve the Paris Agreement goal, if we are to stay with the hope that we could actually stay below the 1.5 and even a bit more than that limit with regards to the target set. We have seen through the exchanges of the past sessions that you've had that cities can indeed, and that's why you're here, you believe that cities can drive and you work with the drive of innovation and sustainable development outcomes in cities. And then, of course, perhaps to state the obvious, but still, let me share some numbers, because urbanization is still one of the most defining trends of our world. By 2050, we believe that 68% of the global population are projected to live in urban settings. If managed well, it can help us to really tackle persistent development challenges today and establish the foundation of more inclusive, resilient and sustainable futures. But at the same time, we need to look at the challenges. Cities account for just 2% of the land footprint, but they also consume 78% of the world's energy. And the global share of emissions attributed to urban areas, of course, buildings, transportation, everything you've discussed here, energy, materials and waste, we have seen an increase with regards to emissions, from 62% of the global share in 2015 to 67 to 72% in 2020. This is, of course, a trend that has to be changed. Cities also bear the brunt of climate impacts, not least, of course, in the global south, in the developing economies, with over 800 million people living in low elevation coastal cities at risk of the impacts of sea rise. Consequences of climate change have deep environmental, but also, of course, as we know, social and health impacts to urban populations, not least the health and the situation of women and children. Of course, elderly people, persons with disability, and in general, the marginalized groups that we have promised not to leave behind. In 2020, about 4 urban dwellers of 1 billion people lived in slums or informal settings, and these numbers keep increasing with the increase of poverty across the world, but also the increase in inequalities that we see. The potential risk posed to urban areas, as well as their role in the climate crisis, as we've heard, is very clear, yet their contributions to driving mitigation and adaptation is also increasingly being captured, and I'm really happy that you have these discussions here today. 7 or 8 years ago, as we know, parties to the Paris Agreement started to submit their first pledges, the ratification of the Paris Agreement, and then these national determined contributions, the NDCs. In the beginning, as we accompanied countries across the world, we could see that this was really a kind of tick-the-box exercise, many times managed by consultants flying into countries and handled by weak ministries of environment. But increasingly, as we as a UN entity, UNDP, alongside with others, have worked on this, we have seen the improvement of the quality, and that these NDCs have actually also been turned into investment plans. We have worked with UN Habitat, with Bloomberg Philanthropies, and Global Covenant of Mayors, highlighting that the NDCs also really much, much stronger, and I think this is important to know, reflect the urban context as they did not do this before. And in our analysis as UNDP, we have seen in 2021 that 81% of the updated NDCs that we have supported in 120 member states actually enhanced level of subnational ownership and inclusion. That means that in the consultations ahead and in the drive to really push national commitments, we saw a lot of engagement, of course, from cities and from regions, but also from actors within this, not least also from the private sector, but also from civil society and academia. So partners are, of course, acknowledging the significance of the urban greenhouse gas emissions, the vulnerability, as I spoke about, with regards to climate disasters that we see across the world happening in front of us. And this is why we believe that we strongly have to use our multilateral networks, the ones that we have in the UN setting, to really make sure that we can make change at a systematic level and really also learn from each other. As I said, we have supported 120 member states, and 85% of them have submitted their NDCs with much, much increased ambition. 90% of them have strengthened also not only the mitigation but also the adaptation targets, and you know, those of you accompanying also the COP, how important the discussions on adaptation are to really get action into place. But what we also see then is the need for international support to these countries so that they can, in the times of crisis that they face, 53 countries now being so highly indebted that they barely have access to the capital market, really also believe that these NDCs can be drivers of the development that they would like to see. City leaders, they do take the center stage. They can do that even further if we are there to support them in different ways. We can accelerate the climate investments and the action, really also turning these NDCs into much more of investment plans. And of course then looking at the public-private partnerships and other key collaborations that can bridge this implementation gap, not least in the countries who do not have access to the capital markets and that have seen a decrease of foreign direct investments throughout the past years. So cities are really at a convergence point. I guess that this is what we have discussed here today. They are experiencing the threats, but they also see the potential. And we certainly see the potential. And we certainly believe that it wouldn't only be Manhattan or Manhattan and Brooklyn that could see a much greener and bluer and sustainable future if we are to work together, those of you in this space, but also those of us who work across the street. In the General Assembly Hall and on the First Avenue, where we have the signs up for UNDP where we say the future is hopeful, because we believe it can be if we work through partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. We've come to the end. I just want to say one big thank you, a very big thank you to our fantastic hosts here at the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce, all of everybody who has helped out to make this event possible. A big thank you to you all. And now I send you out into the sunny Manhattan, and only with these last words, because now the time is now, the race is on, and together, let's pioneer the possible. Thank you, everybody.